I have a disease, and chances are if you're watching this, you have it too. It's called I want to make that ptosis. And seeing this triggered a real bad flare up.
For encounters, I like to shop for inspiration. And when I saw the last episode of Dimension 20's The Unsleeping City, I knew I wanted to recreate that crazy, rotating, living battle stage. I chose to embark on this journey of dreaming and engineering because I had the absolute privilege of DMing through a 2-year campaign. We were able to reach the BBAG and have a beautiful epilogue, and it was... So to celebrate the final battle, I wanted to create something mind-blowing. Something to get me and my players super hyped and to satisfy my soul. So I want to give you permission to do the same. Make that WoW terrain. Make it big and crazy and find the limits of your own creative capacities. Even if it's a loft of work. Even if you don't ever use it again. Or just watch this and live vicariously through me. Now, I wanted this battle to have a surprising second act, so here I am with the giant stage that will start as a whole island held together by magnets, and then break apart into many floating pieces using acrylic rods and 2 Lazy Susans, all unbeknownst to my players. I drew a few drafts before I landed on a general shape and size, and I cut and traced it again, this time making it slightly smaller to start that tapered shape. Once both layers were cut on my Proxxon, I glued them together using the patented liquid PVA hot glue combo. Then it was back to the Proxxon. Cutting these 2 layers of foam flush on the inside of these small islands will add support for when I eventually magnetize them together. Here's where it starts to get tricky. I got these square acrylic rods, which I'm going to use as supports for the floating rotating mechanism, and pre-planned which islands were going to levitate at approximately which heights. I located the center of the entire battlefield and lined up each acrylic rod with that pivot point, then out towards each smaller island. For the lower islands, I carved out a channel and inserted the rod straight through. For islands floating higher up, the rod was going to be on a diagonal, so I built the channel through multiple layers and hoped the friction fit and square rod would be enough to hold it. Either way, for both the lower and upper level islands, I traced out 5 to 6 layers of foam, making each layer smaller and smaller to fulfill that tapered look. Also, my brain was on fire trying to imagine the finished product. For the center island, I didn't need to worry about rod soar rotation, but I did need to make a nice pocket for it to sit in, and also to cover up the Lazy Susan underneath. So while I built the smaller center island to be smaller for each subsequent layer, I built the big center island to expand into the area of the smaller island. I really hope these descriptions are making sense. Either way, once I was happy with all the layers, it was time to carve. And boy, did I carve for a while. On top, I traced in a battle grid with the idea that this island had been ripped up from the center of an old temple, and then textured it by carving in cracks, picking at the corners of tiles, and then stamping heavily with rocks and tinfoil. For the underside, I did some rock carving by slicing, picking, scraping, and bashing. I worked diligently, as taking ample care bore no injuries. The goal was to make these look rocky while also keeping a sort of step structure in case I wanted to use these upside down for nice scatter terrain cliffs. I attempted to fill in the gaps between layers with spackle until I realized I was running out of time, so I only got through about half the pieces before calling it good enough. Back to the top, I laid out liquid PVA and added some rubble with tiny stones and sand. I put these heavily into large crevices and chose some spaced out large patches. I gave them a spritz of isopropyl alcohol and then heavily sprayed watered down PVA glue. I did a couple of layers and also base coated in the classic black acrylic paint mixed with Also base coated in the classic black acrylic paint mixed with matte Mod Podge to make sure everything was stuck together. While it's drying, I went to solidify the plan for the rotating platforms. Because I wanted one layer of floating platforms to rotate clockwise and the other to rotate counterclockwise, I knew I needed 2 rotating mechanisms. I discovered how to make your own sort of lazy Susan with marbles and 2 channeled circular objects. So I cut a hole in the top layer of my base to fit a mason jar lid and the marbles. On top, I used an upside down lazy Susan with the other mason jar lid taped in the center. Did the placement test? Check. I ended up abandoning that round canvas though in favor of a thinner and flatter MDF ring. I glued on these little wings with holes that I drilled to fit the acrylic rods on angles for the upper level islands, and then also drilled holes on the sides of the lazy Susan for the lower level islands. One thing that I liked about making this terrain is that with the modular system I use, spend a lot of time planning pieces out to fit past pieces and future pieces. And with this, I didn't. So it was a nice creative refresher. So instead of carefully adhering to a modular schematic, I simply identified flatter areas, marked a spot with paint, and then smushed it in place to see where it lined up. I used 4mm by 6mm magnets, placed as strategically as possible, testing the strength of each island and continuing to add more as needed. And then it was time to finish painting. I base coated all the undersides and then started sweating because I'm pretty sure this is when I needed to get everything done for the next day, including these foam chains that I magnetized to bridge a crony or 2 across. I painted all the tops with subsequent layers of lighter and lighter gray in drier and drier coats. I think I painted 1 set of bottoms before I decided I so didn't have time for that. And then the most exciting and nerve-wracking part: assembly and reassembly. And while I put this together, thank you to my patrons for their support in making these videos. If you'd like to help me do this full time, head on over to my Patreon page. And here's the final project. What crazy encounters can you think of to take place on this earth-shattering